There was an article that came out by Haaretz, and it talks about how Syria can be a major catalyst for the next world war. And this actually makes sense because of what's happening in Syria. What do you see happening in Syria, everyone? You have the Israelis in the south, you got the Turks controlling the government, and you have the Russians in the Tartus area of Syria on the coast. That's what's happening. And so you have a perfect spot, a perfect hotbed for conflict between serious powers. Russia is a major power. Russia is a superpower. Israel is a superpower. Turkey is a major regional power. It's really a superpower. You have 3 superpowers in one country. And they don't like each other. The Turks and the Russians, they hate each other. The Turks and the Israelis, they hate each other. So yes, Syria will be a major theater of war. A major hotbed for war in the next global conflict. And as the article says here, as the article specifies, Syria could become a catalyst for the next world war. And it says here, since the fall of Assad, IDF forces have been stationed in the buffer zone. Now, Israel is trying to torpedo al-Sharra's vision of a unified Syria. It may find itself facing Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, and perhaps even the Trump administration. So, very interesting. So, al-Sharra, who is really the puppet for the Turks and the puppet for NATO in Syria, he wants to fully unify Syria. Well, in come the Israelis, and the Israelis are working with the Druze because the Druze don't like the current government in Syria. So the Israelis are exploiting divisions in Israel. They want to work with the Druze, and they want to deepen that division in Syria. Why? Because if they can use the Druze, they can then say, well, Syria is not a unified country. Turkey wants to unify Syria. Israel is saying, no, we don't want Syria to be unified. We're going to work with the Druze because the Druze don't like the new government of Syria. So what is that going to lead to? Or what could this lead to? What this could lead to is Turkey saying, wait a second, Israel, you are preventing our goal in uniting Syria under our government. Because Turkey right now controls the capital. Turkey controls most of Syria, but you have the Russians, you have the Israelis, and they also want to take a piece of the pie, or the Israelis want to take a piece of the pie, and the Russians want to keep their presence in Syria, and the Russians definitely don't want a powerful Turkey taking over all of Syria, because then if Turkey takes over all of Syria, then they could dictate whether or not Russia can be in that country, and then eventually there's going to be a clash. Well, that's eventually what's going to happen. Because Russia wants to have its presence in Syria, the Israelis want to have their presence in Syria, Turkey wants to control all of Syria. You have, like I've said before, you have antithetical interests. What happens when you have antithetical interests and no compromise? Eventually there's a clash. Now, is that clash going to happen tomorrow? No, it's not. In fact, I would argue that the Israelis, I would argue that the Turks and the Russians are going to work some sort of diplomacy out as they have done in the past. For example, in Syria, Russian soldiers and Turkish soldiers, for the most part, kept their distance, or they even, in some cases, they even worked together to fight against terrorism, Islamic terrorism. But in some cases, they have even killed each other, which really proves that all the diplomacy is a facade, and at any moment, it can actually dissipate. Now, I say at any moment. Does that mean tomorrow? No. Does that mean next week? No. But in the long run, in the future, given the history of warfare between Turkey and Russia, eventually there's going to be a clash between these powers. And Israel is going to be, Israel really is acting as an impediment to Turkey's goal in controlling all of Syria. How can Turkey control all of Syria if Israel has a military presence in the south? How can Turkey control all of Syria if Russia has a presence in the west coast of Syria, in the Tartus region? So there are antithetical interests at hand here, and eventually this is going to act, these antithetical interests will act as a catalyst to a greater conflict. This is why I, for the most part, I agree with what this article is saying. Now, I highlighted certain parts of the article, so that way I don't have to read the entire thing because that's going to be monotonous. and exhausting. So it says here that the move could lead Israel into conflict not only with the Syrian regime, but also, so what move is this article talking about? The move is Israel remaining in Syria and forming its own security zone in the southern part of Syria. This is what the move is. This is what the article is referring to. And so it says here that the move could lead Israel into conflict not only with the Syrian regime, but also Turkey. Now, the idea of being in conflict with the Syrian regime, the idea that that is separate from conflict with Turkey is just not reality. And I'm sure the author knows this, but you have to be technical, right? So we have to be technically correct. The article is technically correct that the Syrian regime is separate from the Turkish government. But the reality is that the Syrian regime is just a part of Turkey. It's a part of Turkey's power. And the Syrian government right now is just a protectorate of the Turkish government. That's it. It's part of Turkey. So it says here that Israel's move to form its own safety zone in southern Syria could lead Israel into conflict not only with the Syrian regime, but also Turkey and later perhaps the United States. Beyond plans to establish a sterile zone along the border, Israel's actions are widely seen as an attempt to create a civilian security zone, not just a military zone. It's all a military zone. Oh, we want to create a civilian security zone. For who? Oh, the Druze. Not just the Druze. Also Israeli settlers who think that, they have a right to certain parts of Syria, or they have a right to Syrian territory because it's part of this whole greater Israel project. And it says here that the aim is to mobilize the Druze population concentrated in the city of Suwaida as an independent force to deter the presence of hostile groups and torpedo President Ahmed al-Shara's ambition to establish a unified Syrian state. So Ahmed al-Shara wants a unified Syria. Israel says no unified Syria. Keep Syria divided. Why does Israel want to keep Syria divided? It's to keep Syria weak. As long as Syria is weak, it can no longer be a threat to Israel, and Israel can always exploit divisions within Syria, and Israel could even back terrorists, as it did when it was trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, which it did successfully. Israel could back terrorists, prop them up in Syria, so that those terrorists can then be propped up as the big bad villain and the reason as to why Israel needs to remain in Syria to fight terrorists. This is why Israel supports terrorists. Israel supported Jabhat al-Nusra, which is a terrorist organization. They supported Jabhat al-Nusra with money. They gave them money. Why? Because they wanted Jabhat al-Nusra to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Well, Jabhat al-Nusra became HTS. And being a NATO proxy, NATO/Israeli proxy, HTS then eventually overthrew the Bashar al-Assad government, which is exactly what Israel wanted. So Israel funding Jabhat al-Nusra/HTS ended up working in the long run. It ended up working to get Israel's goal of overthrowing Bashar al-Assad to actually succeed. To actually happen. Now, the very terrorist organization that Israel funded is being presented as an enemy of Israel, as a threat to Israel, and as the reason as to why Israel needs to have soldiers in Syria. And this is the reason why Israel backed this group. It wasn't to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Israel didn't give a shit about Bashar al-Assad. Israel never saw Bashar al-Assad as a serious threat. Never. Israel never did. I remember over a decade ago reading the words of Amos Gilad, an Israeli politician, or Amos Gilal, whatever his name is. I think it was Amos Gilad. I remember reading the words of Amos Gilad, in which he said that Bashar al-Assad is not a threat to Israel, and that Israel is not even worried about Bashar al-Assad. That is a fact. The reason why they propped up the HTS to overthrow Bashar al-Assad is to destabilize Syria so they can then have a reason to invade Syria. As I said in the beginning of this live stream, there is no such thing as independence and sovereignty for weak states. If your country is weak, it is not sovereign. End of story. If your country is weak and brittle and divided, it is not a sovereign country. Your country is a satellite state of another country, and your country is being exploited by another country. It's like Ukraine. Ukraine got invaded by Russia. They said, "Oh, America, help us. America, help us." And America said, "Okay, we'll help you." And America spent over $100 billion supporting Ukraine. Didn't do a damn thing. Russia is still winning the war. And now what is the American government saying? What is the American government telling the Ukrainians now? You owe us money. Pay up. You better pay us back all the billions of dollars we gave you to help you in your war, your failed war with Russia. As if America had nothing to do with starting that war. America had everything to do with starting that war because they were messing with the Russians in their backyard. They knew exactly what was going to happen. They knew exactly that they would provoke the Russians to invade Ukraine, and that's exactly what they wanted. And the Americans got what they wanted. And that was Russia to invade Ukraine. And America said, this is great. Now we can get our money with the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex, which is a major, massive, big, fat-ass business in the U.S. Now the military-industrial complex can make tons of money. And we can drain Russia of manpower. Because a lot of Russians have died, and that's what the Americans wanted. A lot of Russian deaths. And so the Americans are now telling the Ukrainians, Ukraine, pay up. And not only that, we want to take your natural resources, Ukraine. And if you want to sell your natural resources, we, the Americans, must be the first country that you make a deal with. And if we don't like the deal, then you can make a deal to sell your resources to another country, but we have to review all the details of whatever dealings you have to sell your resources to another country or countries. In other words, Ukraine, you lost your sovereignty. You have no sovereignty. You're under us. So it was either you were going to be under the control of the Russians or you were going to be under the control of us, the U.S. U.S., us. That's how you pronounce the U.S., us. And so because we helped you out, you owe us. You have no sovereignty. And the Russians are saying, Ukraine, we took a big fat-ass chunk of your country. We took, 20% of your country. We're going to control it now. Because you decided to get in bed with the Americans. You decided to get into bed with the Americans. And what did the U.S. do? The U.S. screwed you. You went into bed. Why do you go into bed with someone? To screw or to get screwed. And you, Ukraine, got screwed. And now you have to pay up. Now you have to pay the price. That's it. You cheated on me. I found you in bed with America. I got pissed. I invaded you. And now I control 20% of your territory. That's the reality. Syria is a weak country, divided country, and therefore it is not sovereign. So they overthrew Bashar al-Assad for what? For what? They lost more of their sovereignty by overthrowing their own leader. And now what? Syria is divided between three major powers: Russia, Israel, and Turkey. And there's eventually going to be a clash between these three powers. Eventually, there's going to be a clash between the Turks and the Russians over who's going to control Syria. Eventually, there's going to be a clash between the Turks and the Israelis over who's going to control Syria. The aim is to mobilize the Druze population concentrated in the city of Sweda, etc., etc. The initiative to allow Syria's Druze community to work in Israel, along with the humanitarian aid being sent to regional villages, and the connections established by Israeli intelligence officers with local leaders, suggests that this is a long-term effort. It resembles the security zone that Israel created in Lebanon during the First Lebanon War. However, unlike Lebanon, where there was almost no central government during the period of the war, Syria has a new regime that is trying to create a unified state. It relies on Turkish political, economic, and military aid. In other words, Israel is messing with a Turkish territory. That's what Israel is doing. And so during the Lebanese Civil War in the 1980s, Israel created, as the article says, a security zone. Israel wants to do the same thing in Syria. The difference between Syria and Lebanon is that during the Lebanese Civil War, as the article specifies, Lebanon had no government. So it was very easy for Israel just to go in there, arm and train the Kataib, and enable the Kataib to butcher the Palestinians and establish an Israeli security zone. It was easier for Israel to do those things than it is for Israel to do what it wants now in Syria. Because Syria, unlike Lebanon in the Lebanese Civil War, is under a major power called Turkey. So Israel thinks that it can just do whatever it wants in Syria and get away with it. It eventually is going to butt heads with the Turks. Because if you are an aspiring empire and you have just invaded your neighbor and you control your neighbor, well, the neighbor from the other side now wants to take over the backyard that you have taken over. You're not going to allow that. This is the situation between Turkey and Israel. And this is why the article says that Syria very likely will be a catalyst for a major conflict. And so it says here, hence the Israeli strategy of exploiting Syria's sectarian divisions to establish zones of influence and potentially control may conflict with regional and international forces. So during the Lebanese Civil War, Israel went into Lebanon and they worked with who? They worked with the Maronites. The Maronites are Lebanese Catholics. So the Israelis said, we're going to work with the Catholics. Amazingly, if you talk to a lot of liberal Jewish people, a lot of Jewish people in general, they will tell you that they hate Catholics. Not a lot of them, but enough of them will. From my experience, they'll say, oh, Catholics, they have a history of anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera. This is very common. But for the first time in history, the Israelis were helping Catholics. And they armed the Catholics and they trained the Catholics. And these Catholics, they were more like your fanatical, hard right, trad Catholic. That's what the Maronites were. They were part of the Kataib. And the Maronites, not all of them were fascist. Not all of them were. But a lot of them were. They were members of the Kataib. And the Israelis trained them. But there was no power in Lebanon that was there to keep the Israelis in check. Now the Israelis are in Syria and they're in a country that is now really, for the most part, a protectorate of the Turks. And the Turks see Syria as a part of its new empire. You have to understand, Turkey is doing what the Americans did when it was partaking in so-called manifest destiny, when the Americans were just expanding in North America, taking more and more territory, and enlarging the size or expanding the size of the American Union. Turkey right now is undergoing this era or this desire of Turkish manifest destiny. It wants to take territory. And so Turkey has taken over Syria, but they are the Israelis. And as the Israelis, just as the Israelis backed the Kataib in Lebanon to create its own sphere of influence, the Israelis are working with the Druze in southern Syria to form its own sphere of interest, its own zone of interest. But inevitably, this is going to clash with the interest of the Turks. So it says here that on Tuesday, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan visited Washington and met with his American counterpart, Marco Rubio, to discuss a number of issues, including forming a joint policy vis-a-vis Syria and lifting American sanctions. So it's very interesting. Before Trump entered office, so Trump got elected, he entered office. Before he entered office, He's talked about the overthrowing of Bashar al-Assad, and he praised the overthrowing of Bashar al-Assad. Why is that? Why did Trump do that? Because Trump is simply aligned with American policy. There was a Chinese guy, a Chinese politician or analyst, I don't remember, but he was a Chinese guy who was talking. He was a Chinese political commentator. And this Chinese political commentator, he said that in the United States, parties change, but foreign policy does not. Foreign policy is aligned with the upper echelons of power within the United States. American foreign policy is aligned with the powers that be, the powers that rule the United States. And so if you become president, you say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. Okay, fine. But what you are going to accomplish is going to be aligned with people who are in the intelligence department. Not all of them, but some of them, at least. And so I believe that in the American intelligence department, there is a conflict between people who are NATOist and people who are non-interventionist. Perhaps there is this conflict that's going on. But I believe that if you become the president, whatever foreign policy you wish to enact is going to be aligned with people in the intelligence community, people in the intelligence department. Politicians can change, but foreign policy does not. And so Trump supports the rise of Turkey. Why? Because that's the policy. The United States wants Turkey to rise up so that they can use the Turks as a weapon against the Russians. It's the same reason as to why the United States has been pushing the Germans to spend more money on their military, to revive their military strength, and to bring back German nationalism. This is why J.D. Vance supported the AfD, because the Americans want to use Russia's biggest historical enemies, the Turks and the Germans. You take Russia's biggest historical enemies, you have them form an axis, and now you have a bigger, meaner dog and a serious threat to the Russians. And this is the goal of the Americans. I think it's very obvious. So Donald Trump rises up, and he just won an election, and he said, oh yeah, Bashar al-Assad got overthrown. This is great. This is great. And then you read this news. Turkey's foreign minister, Hakan Fidan, visiting Washington. This was not big news. Did you guys hear about this? This wasn't big news. This wasn't big news. Why wasn't this big news? People don't really care. But this is the reality. The Turks and the Americans are in cahoots with each other. They're allies. And the Americans want the Turks to rule over Syria. They want the Turks to rise up. They may act friendly towards the Russians, but the reality is that they want to use Turkish nationalist, fascist, Islamist, German nationalist and fascist, and German militarists against the Russians as a proxy. Just like they want to use the Japanese against the Chinese and the Uyghurs against the Chinese. So it says here that the two so Rubio and Fidan expressed support for a unified, stable Syria in a press statement aimed at those attempting to establish independent cantons within the country. You see this, guys? The two expressed support. Marco Rubio, the Zionist, and Fidan, the foreign minister of Turkey, expressed support for a unified and stable Syria. What does that mean? That means Turkey controlling Syria. Amazingly, oh man, I remember this. When Obama got elected the second time, the day after, the morning after Obama got elected, I immediately got up, went on my computer, and I began writing. And I said, here's what's going to happen. And I said, you're going to see a revival of Turkish power. And I said, the Turks want to control Syria. And the Americans will see the Turks as a power of stability to rule over Syria. That's what I wrote in 2011. And I wrote this many times in other articles. This has been a consistent theme in our predictions, in our making predictions in Shubot.com. My father and I have been writing about this for a long time. And so what do you see here? Exactly what I wrote about in 2011. The Americans seeing Turkey as a stabilizing force to rule over Syria. This is what I said. And you're seeing it right here. The Trump administration supporting the rise of Turkish power in Syria. That's what this is. Fidan's visit was also meant to prepare for an upcoming meeting between Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Trump, which is expected to be announced soon. Here, Israel is expected to face another complex obstacle to its strategic goals in Syria. This is very interesting. So it says here, because Israel has its own goals. Israel is terrified of the Turks. They are. The Israelis are terrified of the Turks because the Turks can actually beat Israel. Isn't it amazing? Is it not amazing, guys? The Israelis will sit there and act as if Gaza is the Third Reich. Isn't that what they were saying? They're like the Nazis. Even I was saying stuff like that. They're like the Nazis. They're like the Third Reich. They're like Hitler. Blah, 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 right? Big, evil Third Reich Gaza. And the reality is that it's just a Palestinian trailer park. It's a Palestinian yard that's fenced up. It has no airport. It has no right to travel outside of... It has no right to travel out of Gaza. Yes, there were nice areas of Gaza. Yes, there were wealthy people of Gaza. Guess what? There were nice areas in the ghettos that the Nazis forced the Jews to live in. And the Nazis took pictures of the nice areas of the Jewish ghettos, and they said, look, the Jews are being treated great. Gaza was a limited zone. It was almost like a prison. They had to stay in this area. They couldn't do trade. They couldn't do fishing without being regulated by Israel. They couldn't import goods without the regulation of Israel. It was still being occupied by Israel. The whole idea that Gaza was free in 2005 is bullshit. It's bullshit. And so when Hamas attacked Israel, Israel said, okay, boom, butchered tens of thousands of people. They broke the ceasefire. They killed hundreds and hundreds more. They continued to kill people. And Israel will sit there and act like the big badasses. All these Israeli soldiers will take pictures making fun of Palestinians, mocking Gaza. Israeli soldiers will be in the homes of Gazans, destroying property, mocking the people there. Oh, it's no big deal. This is so great. See how tough we are? We're so tough. We're so strong. In comes Turkey. And Turkey parks its big fat-ass car right in the middle of Syria. And Israel goes into Syria, and Turkey is in Syria, and Turkey is the dominating force in Syria. And what does Israel do? Do you see Israel acting badass? Do you see Israel flexing their muscles? Do you see Israel mocking the Turks? Do you see Israel doing these presentations of strength and charisma? No. You see Israel going to the Americans and begging the Americans to not push the Russians out of Syria because they said, we need the protection from Turkey. You fuckers funded the very terrorists that overthrew Bashar al-Assad. And now you're worried? Now you're scared? Now you want the Russians to protect you? I thought the Russians were an ally of Iran, and Iran is the head of the evil axis. But now you want an Iranian ally to protect you. And now the Americans and the Turks, they've been in bed since the Cold War. They've been in bed even before that, my friends. You go read about World War I. America declared war on Germany in World War I. America did not declare war on the Ottoman Empire. It never declared war on the Ottoman Empire. Ever. ever. And when the Ottomans were butchering the Greeks in the massacre of Izmir, or in the massacre of Smyrna, the Americans watched, for the most part. There were some Americans who did help, Asa Jennings, and there was an American military member who did help Asa Jennings out. There were righteous American soldiers who did save Greeks. I have to say that to be fair. But the official order of the American government, and by extension the U.S. military, was do not get involved. Do not get involved. Why? Because the Americans have never wanted to lose Turkey as an ally. Because Turkey has this thing called the Dardanelles. It has direct access from the Mediterranean into the Black Sea, and vice versa, from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. And that's a very powerful geostrategic position to be in. So America never wanted to lose Turkey as an ally. And so what do you see? The Americans and the Turks are still in bed. So they will sleep with the Israelis, but then they'll sleep with the Turks. And the Turks have this nice, tight opening called the Dardanelles, and everybody wants in on it. Everybody wants in on it. And so what are the Americans going to do? This is what I've said many times. What are the Americans going to do in a situation where they have to choose between Israel and Turkey? Do I side with the Israeli prostitute, or do I side with the Turkish prostitute? Which one? Which one? Which one? Do they want to lose that access from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean? Do they want to lose that control? Because the Americans use the Turks to limit Russia's ability to travel from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean, because the Russians have controlled the Turks have control over the access way from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. And the Americans, in accordance to through the Montreux Agreement, the Americans can tell the Turks, Turkey, don't allow Russia to pass its naval ships through the Dardanelles. And the Turks will tell the Russians, you can't come in here. This is the reason why the Russians almost invaded all of Turkey. Go look into it. Go look at what was happening before the Crimean War that broke out in 1853. Go look at what happened. The Russians were a hair away from controlling all of Turkey. They were a hair away from retaking Constantinople for the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the fucking British got involved, and they sided with the Turks, and they defeated the Russians, 1853 to 1856. The Anglosphere has always been in bed with Turkey. So if the Americans are cornered with a decision, do I choose Israel or do I choose Turkey? I'm going to put myself in the risk of one day having egg in my face, but I believe that one day the Americans will tell the Israelis, sorry, I have a new master now. It'll be like that scene from Aladdin when the genie tells Aladdin, sorry, Aladdin, I have a new master now, and that master was Jafar. What does it say in the Bible about the harlot of Babylon? Her lovers abandon her. And what does St. John say in the book of Revelation? Jerusalem, Jerusalem, which is now Sodom and Egypt. Sodom representing degeneracy and Egypt representing paganism. Sodom and Egypt. And yet you have all these dumbass Zionist types in America, these Zionist Christians who say, Jerusalem, we have to go to the city of Jerusalem. We have to honor. I want to touch the Wailing Wall. I want to touch the Wailing Wall. It's holy. The land is holy. It's in the Bible. Jerusalem is in the Bible. And there's a verse in the Bible that says, Jerusalem, if I forget you, may my right hand be cut off. And so it's talking about the actual literal Jerusalem. When you actually take the time to read Paul's letter to the Hebrews, Paul says there's the earthly Jerusalem, but then there's the Jerusalem up on high. We follow the Jerusalem up on high. That's the Jerusalem that God is focusing on. But yet they want you to focus on the earthly Jerusalem, which St. John condemns as Sodom and Egypt. Sodom and Egypt, it's Babylon. And what does the Bible say about Babylon? Her lovers abandon her. And I believe one day America will abandon Jerusalem. I could be wrong. And if I'm wrong, then I'll admit it. That's if I'm still alive in that time of the future. But I believe Israel will eventually be abandoned and Israel will be destroyed. That's what I believe will happen in the future. I'm not supporting it. YouTube, I'm not supporting it. I am merely making an observation. That's it. But I believe eventually this will happen. And Israel will be devastated just as it was devastated by civil war and by the Roman military during the Roman Judean War, as it was recounted by the great historian Josephus. And what does Jesus say? Jesus told them the whole city of Jerusalem is going to be gone. He didn't say it was going to be gone, but he said, you see all these buildings in Jerusalem? Yeah, they're going to come down. This temple of yours, this temple that you love so much, it's all going to come down. And he said, tear down this temple. I will rebuild it in 3 days. I am the temple. I am the fulfillment of the temple. This temple, this edifice, this physical edifice that you guys revere, it doesn't matter anymore because I'm here now. This is what Jesus was trying to tell them. And what did the Jewish religious establishment do? They went to Pontius Pilate and they said, this man says that he will destroy the temple. He's a terrorist. Not only is he a terrorist, he is a usurper. He is a revolutionary because he has called himself a king and the only king is Caesar. Therefore, Jesus is a terrorist, and they portrayed Jesus as a terrorist. They framed him as a terrorist and they got the Roman government to crucify him. And that is why St. Peter in the book of Acts, when he confronts the Jewish religious establishment, he says, I come here to preach to you Jesus Christ, whom you crucified. This is in the book of Acts. He doesn't say who the Romans crucified, because you have all these evangelicals who say, well, the Romans that were the ones who did, it was the Romans. It was the Romans. Peter says to the Jewish religious establishment, Jesus Christ, whom you have crucified, because they were the ones who crucified Jesus, ultimately speaking. And they portrayed him as a terrorist, and they killed him. And what do you see today in Israel? Israel will say, these people are terrorists. They'll say Christians are terrorists. They'll say moderates are terrorists. They'll say that Israelis who don't agree with doing war crimes on Palestinians are terrorists. And they want those people killed, just as they framed Christ as a terrorist and had him crucified. It's the same mentality. It's the continuation of the same mentality. And they revered this temple so much that they revered the physical temple so much that they murdered the fulfillment of the temple. They revered the temple, and yet they murdered the fulfillment of the temple. And what are they focused on today? They're focusing on building the third temple because they're so obsessed with the physical edifice. And they want to kill, the fanatics that is, they want to kill the people who worship the fulfillment of the temple. And they want to persecute Jewish people who have converted to Christianity. They want to persecute the Jews who follow the fulfillment of the temple, as opposed to this crazy idea of rebuilding the foreshadower of the true temple, which is the physical temple. And so the reverence for the temple that the Jews had in the past led to their demise, because they were so obsessed with the temple that they fought for it to the death, and they even killed themselves in mass cult suicide over the temple. Josephus says that when the temple was lit on fire, that a lot of the Jewish fighters leaped into the flames because they would have rather died. They would have rather died than watch the temple be destroyed. So their love for the physical edifice, and thereby their rejection of the fulfillment of the physical edifice, led to their own demise. Because if they would have followed Christ, if they would have followed the fulfillment of the temple, they would not have cared about the physical temple. And they would not have had all of the fanaticism that led to their own devastation during the Roman Judean War. And suddenly there are riots in Turkey. We have yet to see what's going to come out of that. We really don't know. We really don't know if Erdogan is going to be overthrown or what's going to happen. We don't. My point is, and this is why I did the video on the riots in Turkey not too long after they erupted. My whole point was and still is, there are no good sides in Turkey. This is why I'm not really talking so much about it. I'm just going to wait and see what happens. I'm not going to sit here and do a bunch of videos on the riots in Turkey. They're getting serious, guys. They're getting serious. Erdogan's still in power. They're getting serious. I'm going to wait and see. Perhaps Erdogan will be overthrown. Perhaps he won't. My point is, it doesn't really fucking matter. To a certain extent, it doesn't matter. If the secularists take over Turkey, Turkey's still evil. If the Islamists still have power over Turkey, Turkey's still evil. Doesn't really matter. If you think that it will be better under secularism, under this young Turk type Turkish nationalism, you are falling for the same mistake. You're falling for the same trick that the Armenians fell for before they were butchered. Because when the young Turks took over the Ottoman Empire and made the Ottoman Empire secular, or they secularized a lot of the Ottoman Empire, and these young Turks, they hated Islamism. The Armenians thought this was great. They thought, wow, these secularists have taken over the Ottoman Empire. And guess what? When the young Turks took over the Ottoman Empire, they did nice little gestures for the Armenians. They gave them more rights. They gave them the right to run for public office. And so the Armenians thought that it was great, and they thought that they were going to finally live in peace, and they ended up going through the worst massacres in their history. And those massacres were orchestrated by secularists in conjunction with Islamist. It was an Islamo-secular conspiracy against the Christians of the Ottoman Empire, because it wasn't just the Armenians who were the victims. It was the Assyrian Christians and the Greek Christians. So I do not fall for this bullshit that so many people fall for online that says, well, the secularists are trying to take over the government because they want secularism and they want to bring more democracy and they're the good guys. And I don't fall for that bullshit because I've read the history. Just like when you hear evangelicucks saying, we want to build a third temple because that's going to bring Jesus back. I know those people are out of their fucking minds because I've read enough of the history. I've read enough of the history and I've read enough of the New Testament to know that that's bullshit. Because Jesus said, to hell with your temple. He did. They said, "Oh, look at the temple." There's a story in the New Testament where they go to Jesus. They go to Jesus and they said, "Look at the temple. It's so beautiful." And Jesus, "Yeah, it's coming down." Yeah, I don't care about it because I am the temple. I don't care. And guess what? The temple was destroyed. God destroyed the temple. He did. God destroyed the temple through the hand of the Romans. He destroyed it. So why should I give a shit about a third temple? Unless, of course, I believe that Jesus is actually not the fulfillment of the temple. All these evangelicucks who sit there and tell you that they believe in Jesus, but they're pro-Israel and they want to see a third temple are full of shit. You might as well just talk to a Satanist because a Satanist is actually more honest. These evangelicucks who love Israel so much, they are the antithesis to everything that Christianity stands for. Everything. Because Jesus said, I have come to fulfill the temple. Evangelicucks come along and say, no, we have to build a third temple and we're going to have animal sacrifices. And oh my God, we have a red heifer. We need red heifers in Israel. And I kid you not, you can look into this if you guys don't know about this. There was some Texas evangelicuck rancher who went to Israel. He bred a red heifer. So they said, okay, we need a red heifer to sacrifice in the temple in Jerusalem. And that's going to bring Jesus back. So some evangelical cattle rancher in Texas, bumfuck Texas somewhere, said, well, I'm gonna breed a red heifer. Is that all that's required? Yeah, we need a red heifer. And so you got these lunatics in Israel who said, we need a red heifer. Bring us a red heifer. Hey, some guy in Texas is going to do it for us. Hey. So they breed a red heifer. They go, look, we got a red heifer. Perfect. They send the red heifers to Israel, and these lunatic settlers are taking care of the red heifers, and they're saying, okay, now all we need to bring Jesus back is a temple. But the problem is that you have a mosque on the Dome of the Rock. Like I said, World War III is going to be fought over some rocks. Didn't I say that to you guys? It's the truth. So they're like, yeah, the Muslims have a mosque on the Dome of the Rock, right? It's on the rock. It's on a giant rock. Oh, okay. So we got to build a temple, but that's going to piss off the Muslims. And the Muslims could start killing Jews, and then Jews will kill Muslims, and they're just going to kill each other, and Jerusalem will be stained with blood. That doesn't matter, because bloodshed is going to bring Jesus back. Because there's going to be so much bloodshed over Jerusalem, Jesus will come back. So we'll build a temple, we'll kill a heifer, the Muslims will be mad, and then the Jews and the Muslims will kill each other, but that's great. Bloodshed is great. More death is great. More killing, more butchery. That's what we need, and that's going to bring Jesus back. Do you know how fucking pagan that is? That is pure paganism in its purest form. This is like when the voodoo witch doctor takes a chicken and says, I killed a chicken to bring the spirits. I now evoke the spirits. What is the difference between that and some lunatic from Texas saying, well, if we just go out and kill a red heifer, and then the Israeli guy, an Israeli fanatic, comes and says, we're going to kill the red heifer. Yeah, we're going to kill it in the temple. Then the evangelical says, yeah, we're going to kill a red heifer, and by the blood of that's going to bring Jesus back. The voodooist says, here's the difference. The voodoo doctor says, I'm going to bring the spirits. And these lunatics say, we're going to bring Jesus. It's a false Jesus. It's really the devil that they worship. That's what it is. It's a demon that they follow. They call this demon Jesus. This is what Paul talked about when he wrote to the Galatians. He said, you guys follow a false Christ. And why did he tell the Galatians that they were following a false Christ? Because the Galatians were indulging and partaking in Judaizing. And that's what these people are doing. And that's why they follow a demon that they call Jesus. It's not really Jesus. It's a demon that they call Jesus. And so that's what these people are doing. So the Muslims and the Jews, they're going to kill each other over a rock, the Dome of the Rock. And the Arabs and the Iranians, they're going to kill each other over Mecca. The Turks want to control Mecca. What's in Mecca? A giant rock that they worship. So the evangelical Zionists and the Jews, they worship a rock. It's where the Dome of the Rock lies. They worship a big fat rock. And the Turks, they want a rock called the Black Stone, the Kaaba. It's a rock. Literally, it's a rock that the Muslims worship. And the Iranians want the rock, and the Arabs want the rock, and the Turks want the rock. Well, humanity is going to kill itself over some rocks. How insane is that? How can we not see the insanity of this? We go and kill each other over some rocks. And the evangelicals want to kill people over some rocks. But what all these people refuse to understand is that there is only one rock that we should focus on. Jesus is the rock. And for some strange reason, this rock called Jesus is pissing off the whole world. And I've said this before, it's very possible that the Americans want Erdogan overthrown. Very possible. And it doesn't really matter to the Americans. They can overthrow Erdogan. They'll put in some secular government. Okay, fine. It's still going to be evil. Because those secularists, they still want to control Syria. And the Americans don't mind that. They want Turkey to control Syria. The secularists might say, we're friendly with Israel. That'll be bullshit in the end. Because they have antithetical interests. The secularists, even if they're not Islamists, they still have clashing interests with the Israelis. The interests of Turkey collides with the interests of Israel. Regardless if Turkey is ran by an Islamist or a secularist, those interests for Turkish power is still there. Those interests are still there. So it doesn't matter. The Americans want a secularist to rule over Turkey because they think, well, a secularist will be nice to Israel. But the secularists will still want to control Syria. The Americans don't mind that. They want Turkey to control Syria. And the Israelis still want to have their zone of interest in southern Syria. And because of that, Israeli interest will still be antithetical to Turkish interest, regardless if Turkey is ran by secularists. It's not going to matter. And the secularists are still going to be filled with racists. They're still going to have Turkish ultranationalists in their ranks. And those ultranationalists are still going to have imperialistic ends. Just as the Young Turks, who were secularists when they were running the Ottoman Empire, had imperialistic ends. And so Turkey will still be evil. It'll still be expansionistic. And Israel will still have problems with Turkey, no matter what. What do you think about the disclosure by the Argentinian president of the archives containing the files of Nazis who fled to Argentina after World War II? I think it's all just symbolic stuff. Like, why are they could have done this a long time ago. They're doing this now at a point when people don't give a shit about World War II anymore. Don't give a shit about the Holocaust. What's Israel going to do? They're going to go kill some 100-year-old German